So writing a novel is never easy per se, but I have found that these 3 steps help to make it easier. Hola mis amigas, Cara Nueva. Welcome back to Karina's Adventures, where I enjoy sharing with you, my fellow writers, my journey of writing and some of the things I've learned along the way. So today I want to share with you my 3-step process that I use whenever I'm starting a novel, as well as how much time each step generally takes me and some tips and tricks for along the way. So let's get started. So the first phase is kind of the collecting your ideas phase. It kind of starts just with that first inkling of an idea, and as it builds and grows and takes shape, you want to have a safe place to put down all your ideas so you don't forget them later. So what I generally do is I keep a page of notebook paper for each story that I'm coming up with ideas for, which is usually more than one at once. I tend to keep multiple projects, and that will keep coming up later throughout this video. And then I'll keep those ideas, any research I do, and anything I draw, because I love drawing pictures to help me visualize characters and historical outfits and scenes, just anything that I feel like kind of helps me visualize the story and get a grip on it, and just, it's fun for me to write, to draw pictures and kind of see my story come alive in that way. But I keep all that stuff in a poly folder like this, and that's a safe place for me to keep all of those ideas and drawings and research, so I know it's all in one place even before I've actually started writing the story and it gets itself a binder. So, and then even after I get it a binder, I still leave like my drawings and stuff in here. Sometimes though, like in one of these poly folders, if I have some stories that kind of really aren't getting off the ground or just aren't very big yet and don't kind of get their own folder, I will put more than one. Like I have one in each side of this folder, and I also have just a miscellaneous folder for tidbits of ideas. And so that phase is probably one of the most fun, perhaps the most fun phase, because, you know, you don't have to necessarily do any serious writing, unless, of course, you know, you get to the place where you start writing dialogue. I've started getting to where I sometimes will write page-long scenes and dialogue. If it just comes to me, I have to write it down. But this phase generally takes me, it really depends on the story. The distance between the initial idea and writing down the story, I feel like can take anywhere from a few weeks to several months, simply because it depends on how available I am to move on with the story, how good of a grip I have on the story, and also if I think it's going to be a short story. Obviously that usually has a simpler plot, at least for me, so a lot of times those stories I get to writing a lot quicker because the baseline is simpler and I don't really have to do an outline sometimes on those kinds of story, which leads us to the next step. So when you go to write your outline, first of all, I don't always do this step. Like I said, it really depends on the story. I know there are a lot of writers who don't like using an outline, and that's okay. I totally understand why they don't. If it's a short story, or at least something that I think is going to be a short story, there have been times where I think it's going to be short and then it ends up being like pretty long, which of course, you know, we're writers, that's always actually a nice problem to have. But whenever I think it's going to be a short story, a lot of times I don't write an outline, or maybe I'll just write like kind of the 6 to 8 steps. I did that once recently of kind of what basically is going to happen in the short story, and that way I just kind of have a little map to follow. But when I go to do a real outline, I take my ideas and kind of bring them together and just write in chronological order the steps of things that happen. In the past, on my first kind of chapter book novel that I did and successfully finished, the way I did that outline was I actually did it like, you know, 1, here's the characters, and then, you know, A, B, C, 2, here's the plot, and A, B, C. Like, it was more of a formal outline, like what you would do in English class or something before writing an essay. But now I generally go a little bit more loosey-goosey and just kind of write out the steps, so it's not technically an outline, it's more of a list. And I don't always, especially if I have a ton of notes, don't always put everything from my notes into the outline, especially because sometimes along the way, if your ideas phase goes on for a long period of time, or if your outline goes on for a long period of time. I have one story in particular that I have been working on for, oh gee whiz, a couple of years at this point, that has changed so much because of so many problems. I mean, it doesn't even take place really in the same setting anymore. Like, I think 1 or 2 characters have actually remained the same throughout all this time. I have had to write multiple outlines for that, and so the story has changed so much. It's kind of an exaggerated example, but the story has changed so much that obviously I don't include every idea I ever had for this story or the versions of it when I go to write an outline. What I also like to do, if there is something that I included in my notes but there isn't really room for in my list or outline or whatever you want to call it, I will leave like an asterisk or a star or something like that, and then that will serve as a cue and, that there is something extra in my notes, whether that be dialogue or kind of a scene written out. And I'll, you could put also a matching symbol in the notes so that you can find it easily when you go to write your story. Obviously, if you're doing this on the computer, you can just do that in your word processor as well. I have always used real paper, like physical paper, for my writing, so that's what I like to use. So the outline for me depends on how well prepared I am. Usually the outline only takes a few days or a week, or less. Sometimes, of course, if I'm having a really good day, I can get it done in just like less than a day or something. But sometimes it does drag out, like I mentioned, if I have to write the outline more than once. But if you have your ideas kind of well together, generally the outline doesn't take me that long. So, what are you to do after you have all of your beautiful drawings and your wonderful notes and a very nice, organized outline? There's only one thing left to do. Write the baby. Get your story written down on paper in the first draft. So, this is the last of the 3 steps, obviously, to getting your first draft written, is write the first draft. So, few tips for you. Don't get stuck with your outline. I use the outline sort of as a map as I'm going along the way, but you could say that I don't keep my head in the map the whole time. I will reference it whenever I feel like I'm getting stuck. That way it provides me kind of a vision, but I also just kind of write and let that flow and don't let referencing the outline get me stuck. There have been times where I actually end up leaving things out that I had included in the outline simply because I forget to include them in the writing process, and that's okay. Another thing that happens a lot is I will discover I had steps missing in my outline. I wasn't quite detailed enough, so as I go, I just kind of fix that. Sometimes there are even parts of the story that you discover aren't necessary, so you leave out as you go, and that's what editing will be for later. So, an example of this particular instance would be whenever I was writing a story about a girl living on an island, and she has this parrot in the beginning of the story that's kind of a companion to her, and a little bit into the story, I realized that that parrot served nothing to the plot like the other animal companion characters did, so I just stopped mentioning the parrot, and that was actually a much easier fix later, just taking out the references to the parrot than trying to write the parrot in as something it wasn't, and then trying to undo all of that later. So just follow your instincts, kind of fly by the seat of your pants when you need to, but also you kind of have that outline there as a safety net if you get stuck and forget kind of what the next thing was. And for me, it kind of also serves as a little motivation when I see like, oh yeah, lines from now on the outline, it's that scene I'm really excited about writing. That kind of gives me motivation to get through this. Oh, this is such a boring part. Nothing exciting is happening. Let's get to that. Ooh, yeah, five sections down on the outline. Not too far away. Let's get there. Anyway, you probably know what I'm talking about. But when I go to write the first draft, I have different ways of keeping it organized. I always used to use, well, not always. At times, back when I was a lot younger, before I was really writing novels, I just kept my papers in Ziploc bags, so I wouldn't really recommend that if your story gets to be very long. But then, of course, I switched over to using binders. They're very handy for keeping your notes. Obviously, I kept the illustrations in one of these poly folders like I've been doing for years and years. And then, recently, I have also tried putting the first draft into one of these little document holders like they have at Walmart for just a few bucks until the story gets very big. I mostly did this because I was running low on binders at the time, and it kind of was a less bulky option for a story that wasn't quite suited for a binder. It needed to grow up a little bit. The time I would expect this to take for my length of novels that I write generally takes me about 6 months to get the first draft written. That's what I've found I can kind of expect from myself to get the first draft written. Now that sounds like a long time, I know. You're probably thinking, well gee, 6 months, how many stories am I going to be able to produce if it takes me 6 months to write the first draft? I mean, maybe I'm the only one that thinks that way, but anyway. I am not only working on one story at a time. I mean, this may be true for you too, I don't know, but I always have at least 3 projects that I'm working on. Generally, the way I structure it is I have 2 main projects, one of which is from my kind of main area that I write in, and then I have another novel that's kind of my next project, and then I have a menagerie of side projects, whether that be short stories and screenplays and children's stories and things like that. And generally the way it works is there are a couple stories that I just dabble in when I feel like it, and then I have a couple of side projects that I'm actually trying to get done. And the way I work with those is while I'm working on the main 2 projects, I kind of have a rule for myself at the moment where I need to get 1 short story done before I start the next side project. That way I don't have like 3 short stories I'm trying to work on at the same time and they're all getting stuck. But anyway, you can see how I have more than 1 project going at a time, so even though it might take me 6 months to write the first draft, I'm probably working on starting new stories and hopefully also finishing some other stories along that journey. So, I hope this helps you for getting started on your novel and how much time you can kind of expect that to take. Obviously, short stories generally take me much less time than my novels. Short stories can take me just, you know, a couple months, sometimes less than that, depending on the circumstances. So I hope this is helpful. Have fun writing your novels, and if you have any variations of this structure or any other tips, maybe you don't like using structure and you have something else that works for you, please let me know down in the comments. I love learning from my fellow writers because I know we all have a lot to say. Well, I mean, that's why we're writers, right? Anyway, have a blessed day, happy writing, get out there and write the story that God calls you to tell. Adios, mis amigas, Dios te bendiga, have a blessed day, and happy writing.